So I want you to imagine trying to hold a really complicated, randomly generated 10-digit phone number in your head.
Right, like an old school phone number before we could just save them all.
Exactly. You are repeating it over and over, just desperately trying not to drop a single digit. But while you are holding that number in your working memory, you're simultaneously fighting this overwhelming primal urge to eat a giant, delicious marshmallow sitting right in front of you.
Which is hard enough on its own, honestly.
Oh, absolutely. And just to push the situation completely over the edge, the fundamental rules of gravity around you keep changing without warning. Like up is suddenly down and left is suddenly right.
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It does, but that feeling of total, absolute mental overload, that sensation of your brain screaming for a break because it's processing way too many conflicting signals at once, that is exactly what being a 2 to 3-year-old toddler feels like every single day.
I love that analogy because it captures the internal landscape of a toddler perfectly.
Robin?
We tend to look at them and you just see the visible output,
Right, the tantrums.
Exactly. The sudden tantrums, the refusal to put on shoes, the seemingly irrational meltdowns over a broken cracker. But underneath that behavioral surface, they are fielding a constant bombardment of novel sensory information.
Like the gravity shifting.
Yes, they're dealing with new social rules and massive biological impulses. And they're doing all of this without the fully developed mental architecture required to process it smoothly.
Yeah.
I mean, the neurological heavy lifting happening every second of their day is just staggering.
It really is. So today, for this deep dive, we are pulling insights from a massive breakdown on early cognitive development. We want to figure out how you, the caregiver, can actually build that brain architecture without turning your living room into some sterile preschool classroom.
Which nobody wants to do.
Right. The source material we're looking at is an extensive review of evidence-based activities to support cognitive development and executive function in 2 to 3-year-olds.
And this is such a critical window.
It really is. And since you, our listeners, are already pretty well versed in the big three of executive function, working memory, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility, we aren't going to spend a ton of time redefining those basics.
We know what they look like in action.
Yeah, we know working memory is holding the phone number, inhibitory control is resisting the marshmallow, and cognitive flexibility is adapting to that shifting gravity. What this research forces us to look at, though, is the critical timeline.
Because the timeline is the entire crux of the argument here.
Mhm.
We know from longitudinal data that executive functions undergo a massive, dramatic explosion of growth between ages 3 and 6.
That's when you really see it.
Right. You see kids suddenly able to play complex games with rules, share toys without immediate violence, and actually plan ahead a little bit.
Without hitting each other.
Hopefully.
Mhm.
But because that visible explosion happens at ages 4 and 5, people assume that is when the crucial development is occurring.
But it's not.
Well, the neurological bedrock, like the foundational wiring, that actually dictates how high that later peak can reach, that is laid down at ages 2 and 3.
Wow.
The research emphasizes that warm, responsive caregiving and specific everyday experiences in this exact window are causally important for later life. Like, they literally predict better executive function years down the line.
You know, listening to this, it really reminds me of an air traffic controller.
Oh.
Well, we spend so much time worrying about the airplanes, like the vocabulary words, the colors, the numbers, a toddler's ability to name 20 different dinosaurs.
That's our party tricks.
Exactly. But all those cool airplanes are completely useless if there is no air traffic controller up in the tower to direct them.
That's a great way to look at it.
If the controller can't tell one airplane to wait while another lands or prioritize the airspace, the airplanes just crash into each other. You get meltdowns. Executive function is that control tower, and ages 2 to 3 is when we pour the concrete for that tower.
I think we have to push that analogy even further, actually. Pouring the concrete for that control tower requires a really stable environment.
Right.
You cannot build a world-class cognitive air traffic control tower on top of an earthquake. There's a biological baseline that must be established before any of the higher-order cognitive activities we're going to discuss can even register in the brain.
Which makes sense. But before we get to the biology, we should probably just address the elephant in the room right away.
Let's do it.
Because there's an entire, multi-million-dollar industry out there telling parents that the way to build this cognitive tower is by buying digital tools.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere.
You see iPads loaded with these quote-unquote brain training games,
Yeah.
flashcard apps, software that promises to boost working memory in preschoolers. And honestly, the marketing is incredibly compelling.
It's very persuasive, yeah.
So, do these digital shortcuts actually lay the concrete we're talking about?
The scientific consensus presented in this deep dive is just a resounding no.
Wow. Just a flat no.
Pretty much. The source actually cites specific research by Melby Lervoig and Holm, alongside another researcher named Shipstead, and they looked really intensely at computerized working memory training in preschoolers.
And what did they find?
The fundamental flaw with these apps is a concept called poor transfer.
Okay, let's drill into the physical reality of poor transfer. Because if my kid is playing a game where they have to um, remember a sequence of 4 flashing colored lights, their brain is doing work, right?
Yes, definitely.
So why doesn't that help them remember a sequence of instructions in the real world, like put on your shoes and grab your coat?
The brain is doing work, but it's highly localized, highly specific work.
Yeah.
When a child practices the flashing light game, the neural pathways associated with recognizing those specific visual stimuli on a backlit 2D screen become incredibly efficient.
Right.
The brain undergoes myelination, which is adding a fatty sheath to the neurons to speed up transmission, but only for that specific task. The brain gets exceptionally good at playing the app.
So they just become professional iPad players.
Essentially, yes. However, real-world executive function is domain independent. Remembering to go upstairs, get your socks, and bring them down requires integrating spatial awareness, auditory memory from your spoken instruction, and the physical inhibition to walk past a basket of toys.
Which the iPad does not simulate at all.
Not even a little bit. The tablet game doesn't recruit those complex, interconnected networks. The strongest single variable in toddler cognitive outcomes, according to the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard, is actually the quality of adult-child interaction.
Human connection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Human connection builds domain-independent architecture. Apps just build domain-specific tricks.
Okay, so if the apps are out, we are back to the raw biology. You mentioned the earthquake earlier. The source lays out 3 biological non-negotiables that absolutely have to be met before cognitive training even matters.
And they are non-negotiable for a reason.
Right. And it starts with sleep. The recommendation is 11 to 14 hours per 24-hour period, which includes naps. But what is physically happening in the prefrontal cortex if they only get, say, 9 hours? Why does the brain actually care?
Sleep is not merely a period of inactivity. I think that's a huge misconception.
Yeah.
It is an active state of neurological housekeeping.
Housekeeping, like sweeping up.
Literally, yes. During deep sleep, the brain's glymphatic system flushes out metabolic waste products that accumulate during waking hours. Furthermore, sleep is when synaptic pruning and consolidation occur.
Oh, right. So keeping the good connections and dropping the bad ones.
Exactly. The connections the child used that day are strengthened, and the unused ones are pruned away. If a toddler is sleep-deprived, the prefrontal cortex, which is the region responsible for those executive functions, is bathed in metabolic waste.
Yikes.
And it lacks the metabolic energy to enforce top-down control. So it defaults control back to the amygdala, which is the primitive emotional center.
Oh, wow. So that is why a tired toddler is an impulsive, highly reactive toddler. Their prefrontal cortex is basically offline.
It's running on fumes, yeah.
Okay, the second non-negotiable is nutrition. The document specifically highlights iron, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids, particularly DHA. I mean, I understand we need calories for energy, but why is something specific like iron causally linked to executive function deficits?
Iron is a fundamental cofactor in the synthesis of neurotransmitters, particularly dopamine.
Okay, dopamine, the reward chemical.
Right. But dopaminergic pathways are heavily involved in the frontal lobe's ability to maintain focus and execute planned movements. If a child is iron deficient, they are literally lacking the chemical messengers required for the air traffic controller to send signals to the airplanes.
So the controller's up there, but his radio is broken.
Exactly. And zinc is similarly crucial for neurogenesis and the structural integrity of the brain. And DHA forms the structural components of cell membranes in the central nervous system.
So that directly impacts how efficiently the signals travel between neurons.
You've got it.
All right, the third pillar is physical activity. And the source points to the World Health Organization guidelines of at least 180 minutes of varied movement a day. That's 3 hours.
It is. It's a lot of movement.
I want to play devil's advocate here because the reality of modern parenting is brutal.
Oh, completely.
So by establishing these non-negotiables like perfect sleep, nutrient-dense meals perfectly balanced with DHA, and 3 hours of running around, are we inadvertently telling exhausted, overworked caregivers that if they can't achieve this pristine biological state, they're failing their child's brain?
It's a crucial distinction to make, and I'm glad you brought it up. The research is not demanding a pristine, idealized state of perfection. It is demanding an acknowledgement of physiological reality.
Okay, what does that mean practically?
The rule of thumb the source provides is highly practical. If a child is experiencing a blood sugar crash, or if they miss their nap and are visibly dysregulated, the absolute best brain-building activity you can offer in that moment is a snack or a nap.
Just feed them and put them to bed.
Yes, you cannot behavioral parent your way out of a biological deficit.
So the message isn't be perfect. The message is don't try to force a complex working memory game on a kid whose prefrontal cortex is currently offline due to a lack of glucose.
Exactly.
You have to meet the biological need first, without guilt, because that is the foundation.
Precisely. We have to view sleep and food not as interruptions to development, but as the fuel that makes development possible.
I love that.
Once that biological baseline is reasonably stable, then we can look at the environment around them. We can look at the toys already scattered across the floor and realize that we don't need a catalog of expensive developmental tools. The shift is entirely in how we interact with what is already there.
That is huge. So let's bring that right into the living room. Let's look at the classic toddler activity, pretending. A kid picks up a block and pretends it's a car. The document refers to this as Vygotskian mature play.
Yes, named after Lev Vygotsky.
Right, and it makes a huge distinction between just randomly banging pots and actual mature pretend play. What takes a play session from just making noise to something that actively wires the prefrontal cortex?
The distinction lies in the level of cognitive load required to sustain the scenario. This draws heavily on curriculums like Tools of the Mind, which are built on Vygotsky's theories.
Okay.
Mature pretend play involves extended, imagination-rich scenarios where roles are explicitly named in advance. The child commits to staying in that character, and props are used flexibly.
Flexible props, meaning like using a stick as a wand.
Yes. The neurological mechanism here is profoundly complex. When a 2.5-year-old decides that a plastic cup is now a hat for their teddy bear, they're forcing their working memory to hold two conflicting realities simultaneously.
Because they have the dominant visual reality, it's a cup, I drink out of it. And the imagined reality, it's a hat.
Yes, and crucially, they have to actively recruit inhibitory control networks to suppress the dominant reality.
Wow.
The brain's object recognition pathways are screaming, "This is a cup, put it to your mouth." The prefrontal cortex has to step in and dampen that signal, overriding it with a top-down rule. In this scenario, we treat this object as a hat.
You know, watching a toddler do this feels incredibly similar to watching a Hollywood actor engage in method acting.
Oh, that's a fascinating comparison.
Yeah, because you aren't just reciting lines, you are fully committing to a role and actively inhibiting your natural personality to stay in character. When a toddler decides they are a doctor, they have to suppress their normal toddler impulses and act how they believe a doctor acts. That requires immense cognitive stamina.
The stamina is exactly what we are trying to build. But a 2-year-old generally lacks the ability to sustain that method acting for more than a minute or two on their own.
Right, they get distracted.
They lose the thread.
Yeah.
That is where the adult comes in, not as a director dictating the action, but as a cognitive scaffold. The source outlines a very specific 3-step method for caregivers. Plan briefly, join to model, and stretch when it stalls.
Let's map that onto a real scenario. Say I'm sitting on the rug with a toddler, a stuffed bear, an empty bowl, and a spoon. How do I execute this 3-step scaffold without, just hijacking their play entirely?
Well, step 1 is the plan. You don't just start shoving the spoon at the bear. You establish the mental framework out loud. You say, your bear looks so hungry this morning. Are you going to make him breakfast? What are you cooking in your kitchen?
Oh, I see. You are forcing them to pre-visualize the scenario. You're setting the rules of the simulation.
Exactly.
And demanding that their prefrontal cortex load the breakfast program.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
Step 2 is joining to model. They might stare at the empty bowl, unsure how to proceed because there's no actual food in there. So you model the inhibition.
How do you do that?
You take the spoon, scoop absolutely nothing out of the empty bowl, and say, this oatmeal smells delicious. Here you go, bear. Careful, it's hot. You demonstrate how to override the physical reality of the empty bowl. You do one round, and then you immediately step back and hand over the spoon. You let them take the lead.
Okay, so they feed the bear for a minute or two, but inevitably they get distracted. The dog walks by, or they just drop the spoon and look away. The play stalls out.
That is the critical moment. The instinct for most of us is usually to either walk away or just start cleaning up. But step 3 is to stretch the play.
Right, keep them in character.
Exactly. You introduce a complication that requires cognitive flexibility. You say, uh-oh, the bear ate all the oatmeal, but now the bunny is knocking on the door. He's hungry too. What should we feed the bunny?
You inject a new problem.
Yes. Now the child has to adapt the scenario, hold the new character in working memory, and generate a new sequence of actions. You've just turned a 2-minute fleeting interaction into a 15-minute sustained cognitive workout.
The source gives some brilliant examples of this, actually, like the doctor visit, checking a stuffed animal's ears, giving them a bandage, or packing a suitcase for a pretend trip, which sneaks in an incredible amount of categorization.
Like, we need warm clothes for the snow. What goes in the bag?
Exactly. But I want to highlight something the text explicitly warns against. It says we must resist the urge to correct their realism.
That is a vital point. If the child decides that a wooden block is a ringing telephone, and you say, no, honey, that's a block, telephones have buttons, you have instantly collapsed the symbolic work they are doing.
Because you prioritized factual accuracy over cognitive flexibility.
Exactly. Similarly, interrupting the flow of pretend play to make it traditionally educational is counterproductive.
Like stopping the tea party to ask, how many blue cups do we have? Can you count them for me?
Yes, exactly. When you demand they count the cups mid-scenario, you break the pretend frame. You pull them out of the character they were sustaining.
Which defeats the purpose.
The executive function workout is occurring in the act of pretending, in the mental juggling of realities. Rote counting actually requires less complex prefrontal activation than sustaining a shared imaginary world.
Okay, let's pivot from the imaginary world to the intensely physical world of puzzles and building blocks. If you look at any list of brain-building toys, shape sorters and wooden jigsaws are always right at the top.
Always.
And the assumption is that the benefit is entirely about fine motor skills, right? Like the physical act of getting the square peg into the square hole. But the research points to a completely different, almost invisible mechanism.
The physical motor skill is the vehicle, but the actual cognitive architecture is built by something else entirely. Adult spatial language.
Okay, break that down for me.
The document heavily relies on longitudinal research by Susan Levine at the University of Chicago. Her team recorded parents and toddlers playing with puzzles and blocks between the ages of 2 and 4.
And what did they see?
They found that the sheer volume of specific spatial words that parents used during play directly predicted the child's mathematical reasoning skills years later, at age 4.5.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm really grasping the magnitude of this. The physical act of the kid doing the puzzle didn't predict the math scores as strongly as the words the parent was saying while the kid did the puzzle.
That is exactly what the data indicates. When a child attempts to place a puzzle piece, they're utilizing visuospatial working memory.
Right.
They have to hold the target image, the shape of the hole, in their mind, look at the piece in their hand, and mentally rotate it to see if it matches. This is incredibly taxing. When an adult sits alongside them and narrates the struggle, using precise spatial vocabulary words like rotate, edge, underneath, corner, flat side, parallel, they are giving the child symbolic hooks.
They are providing the linguistic software required to run the mental rotation hardware.
Beautifully put. You are giving them the conceptual tools to organize 3D space in their mind. Instead of the child just experiencing raw, frustrating trial and error, just jamming the piece against the board, the parent says, look at this flat edge. Where's the flat edge on the board? Try rotating it so the edges line up.
So the child learns to attach words to physical dimensions.
Yes, which is the foundational prerequisite for geometry and complex math down the road.
What I love about this is that it completely democratizes the concept. You don't need a $50 artisanal wooden puzzle to use spatial language. The source points out that you can embed this into the most mundane daily routines. Loading the dishwasher is suddenly a masterclass in spatial reasoning.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
When you are loading the dishwasher with a toddler, you narrate the spatial relationships. The big flat plates go on the bottom rack. These tall glasses need to go in the back, underneath the sprayer. The small spoons go inside this square basket.
You are just bathing them in spatial vocabulary in a real-world context.
Exactly.
Even getting dressed. Put your arm through the sleeve, your head goes in the top, let's rotate the shirt so the tag is in the back. You are constantly reinforcing how objects move and relate to one another in space. It turns a chore that usually involves me just wrestling a shirt onto a squirming kid into a deliberate cognitive exercise.
And this cumulative exposure over months and years builds a spatial vocabulary that profoundly alters how their brain processes visual information.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered how spatial language structures the brain during active play, but I want to shift our focus to how language operates during quiet, focused moments. Let's move from the chaos of the living room to the bookshelf.
A great transition.
We are looking at what the source calls dialogic shared book reading. Most people assume that reading to a toddler is a passive transfer of information. I read the words, you listen to the words.
That passive model is entirely what dialogic reading seeks to dismantle. The paradigm shift is moving from a one-way broadcast to a two-way conversation. The adult and the child essentially trade roles. The child becomes the storyteller, and the adult becomes the active listener and prompt generator.
To understand why this matters, we have to look at the neurology of conversation. The Harvard Center on the Developing Child has published extensively on this concept of serve and return.
It's a foundational concept.
It's not just about the sheer number of words a child hears. If I put an audiobook on for 3 hours, they hear thousands of words, but it doesn't build the brain the same way. Why?
The difference lies in the neural networks activated by the back-and-forth exchange. When a child listens passively, their auditory processing centers are active. But when they are engaged in a conversational turn like, you ask a question, they have to process it, retrieve vocabulary, formulate a response, and speak it aloud. It drastically increases activation in Broca's area.
And Broca's area does what?
This region in the frontal lobe is critical for speech production and language processing. The effort required to generate language, rather than just receive it, is what strengthens the neural pathways associated with higher-order communication.
Okay, the source gives us a very practical framework for executing this during story time using 2 acronyms, peer and crowd. Peer dictates the rhythm of the interaction. Let's walk through what that actual rhythm feels like when you are sitting with a book.
Peer stands for prompt, evaluate, expand, and repeat. It's a cyclical process you apply to the pages. First, you prompt the child to engage with the material. What is the little puppy doing in this picture? Second, you evaluate their response. They say, running. You evaluate by validating, yes, he is running.
Right, you confirm they're correct.
Exactly. Third, you expand on their language, adding complexity. He is running very fast across the green grass. And finally, you repeat the prompt or ask them to echo the expansion to ensure the new vocabulary registers. Can you say green grass?
It turns reading a 10-page board book into a deeply interactive dialogue. And the second acronym, crowd, gives us a menu of different types of prompts to use so we aren't just constantly asking, what's that? Let's apply crowd to some classic books.
Crowd provides 5 distinct cognitive challenges. The C is for completion prompts. These rely heavily on auditory working memory and pattern recognition.
Give me an example.
If we look at Goodnight Moon, instead of reading the whole sentence, you pause at the end of the rhyming couplet, Goodnight room, good night, and you wait. The child has to retrieve the rhyming word moon from their memory and verbalize it.
The R is recall. This tests episodic memory. If we are reading The Very Hungry Caterpillar, halfway through the book I might stop and ask, wait, what did he eat on the very first day?
Right.
They have to mentally rewind the narrative, locate the image of the apple, and retrieve the word.
The O is open-ended prompts. These are excellent for books with rich illustrations. You simply point to a chaotic scene and ask, what is happening over here? This forces the child to use expressive language to construct their own narrative based on visual cues rather than just answering a yes or no question.
Makes total sense.
The W stands for why prompts, the classic who, what, where, when, and why questions that build factual comprehension.
And the final one, D for distancing, feels like the most advanced cognitive leap.
Distancing prompts require the child to take the abstract concepts from the book and apply them to their own lived reality. If you're reading Goodnight Moon, you pause and ask, we say goodnight to the moon and the red balloon in the book. What things do we say goodnight to in our house before we go to sleep?
Oh, wow. That requires bridging the gap between the fictional world and their autobiographical memory. It's a profound test of cognitive flexibility.
It really is.
Now, all of this language so far has been external, how we talk to the child. But the document introduces a concept in Activity 8 that I found entirely counterintuitive. It focuses on how we talk to ourselves in front of the child. It advocates for adult-modeled self-talk.
This is deeply rooted in Vygotsky's theory regarding the development of the internal monologue. Vygotsky posited that self-regulation does not spontaneously generate within the child's mind. It begins as a purely external process.
Like, don't touch that.
Exactly. A parent tells a child, don't touch the stoves, it's hot. The regulation comes from the outside. The next developmental phase is private speech. This is when you hear a toddler playing alone, muttering a constant stream of instructions to themselves. Now the car goes here, no, the red block goes on top.
Yes, you hear them whispering in their rooms.
They're using their own vocal cords to replicate the external regulation they previously received from adults.
They are essentially programming their own prefrontal cortex out loud.
Exactly. And the final phase, which typically solidifies in early elementary school, is when that private speech internalizes and becomes the silent inner voice that adults use to plan, reason, and regulate emotions.
Right.
The source argues that we can dramatically accelerate and enrich this process by deliberately modeling our own internal monologue out loud for the toddler to hear.
The example given is so mundane, but it perfectly illustrates the point. You are in the kitchen, chopping an onion, your eyes start watering, you're getting annoyed. Normally, an adult just suffers in silence or maybe lets out a sigh, figures out a solution, and moves on.
We internalize the frustration.
Right. But the text suggests you narrate the entire struggle. You say aloud, I am chopping this onion. It is making my eyes sting in water. I feel frustrated. I'm going to try putting the onion in the freezer for 2 minutes to see if that helps.
It feels silly, but it's powerful.
I have to challenge this, though, because there is a very deep-seated parental instinct to project competence. We want our children to feel safe, and we often equate safety with the parent being an unshakable superhero who effortlessly navigates the world. If I am constantly narrating my struggles and frustrations, aren't I risking making the child anxious that their caregiver isn't in control?
It is a totally rational fear, but from a developmental neuroscience perspective, projecting effortless perfection is actually doing the child a disservice.
Really?
Yes. If you hide the friction of daily life, the toddler only sees the magic trick. They see a problem exist, and then they see the adult seamlessly produce a solution. They never see the cognitive machinery required to get from point A to point B.
Oh, I see.
They never see how a competent human being processes frustration, formulates a hypothesis, and tests a solution.
So when they inevitably face a problem they can't instantly solve, they think they've broken because they've never seen an adult struggle.
Precisely. By narrating the onion scenario, you are giving them the blueprint for emotional regulation. You are modeling the pause between stimulus and response. When you say, I feel frustrated, I'm going to take a deep breath, you are demonstrating how to recruit the prefrontal cortex to dampen the amygdala's alarm system.
You are teaching them that negative emotions are not emergencies. They are just data points that require a regulated response.
Exactly.
The text pairs this with a technique called the Batman effect, which is a form of self-distancing. How does invoking a superhero help a toddler regulate?
Self-distancing leverages the fact that it is always easier to solve someone else's problem than your own. When a child is engulfed in a wave of frustration, say they can't get their shoes on, their working memory is flooded with the emotional distress.
You're just spiraling.
Right. If you ask them, how can you calm down? They can't access the answer. But if you shift the perspective and ask, what would Daniel Tiger do right now? Or what would a brave firefighter do? You create psychological distance.
You are asking them to access the behavioral rules associated with that character rather than dealing with their own immediate emotional state. It's easier for Daniel Tiger to be brave and try again than it is for the dysregulated toddler. It gives them a back door to their own inhibitory control.
Yes, that's a brilliant way to phrase it. A back door to their own control.
I want to transition now to what might be the most relieving section of this entire deep dive. We've talked about dedicated play, we've talked about reading routines, but anyone who spends their days with a toddler knows that a massive portion of the day is just consumed by the unrelenting need to keep a household functioning.
Laundry, cooking, cleaning, it never ends.
Exactly. The incredible news here is that you don't have to pause the cognitive development to get the chores done. The chores are the cognitive weight training.
We often view toddlers as obstacles to household efficiency. We try to distract them with a screen so we can quickly cook dinner. But executing a multi-step household chore is actually one of the most neurologically demanding tasks a human can perform. Let's look at cooking, or what the source terms real-life multi-step routines.
The text has a phrase that I think every caregiver needs to internalize. The inefficiency is the point. If I am making pancake batter alone, I can do it in 4 minutes. If I invite my 2.5-year-old to help, it will take 25 minutes, half the flour will end up on the floor, and I will be exhausted.
It's painful, honestly.
Why is that agonizing inefficiency biologically valuable?
Because that 25 minutes of chaos is a sustained executive function stress test. To participate in making pancakes, the child has to hold a multi-step sequence in their working memory. First, we scoop the flour, then we pour it in the bowl, then we add the milk. While holding that sequence, they must actively engage inhibitory control to suppress the overwhelming tactile impulse to just bury their hands in the flour bag, or the impulse to drink the milk straight from the carton. They have to continuously monitor their own motor output to aim the cup at the bowl.
And unlike a tablet game or an artificial puzzle, the stakes are real. They understand that the goal is actual food. The real-world context provides an intrinsic motivation that artificial tasks simply cannot replicate.
No, they really can't.
The source provides some beautiful examples of culturally embedded routines that naturally function as EF training. Things like the daily feeding of a sourdough starter, discarding the old, measuring the flour, stirring the water, or the Ethiopian tradition of making injera.
The injera example is perfect because it embeds a massive delay tolerance challenge right into the process.
How so?
First, we pour the batter onto the hot mitad, which is the griddle, and then we must wait for the eyes or bubbles to form before we cover it. Standing in front of a hot stove, smelling the food, and having to physically inhibit the urge to touch it while waiting for a specific visual cue. The bubbles is pure prefrontal exertion.
Wow. If cooking is too messy, the source highlights the Bring Me game, which completely blew my mind in its simplicity. You just tell your toddler, go to your room, get your blue shoes, and bring them to me in the kitchen. It sounds like an errand, but let's map the cognitive load required to execute that.
It is a heroic cognitive journey for a 2-year-old. First, they must encode the auditory instruction and hold the target object, the blue shoes, in their working memory. They must also hold the destination return to the kitchen.
Okay, they've got the map.
Then they begin the physical journey. They walk down the hallway and past the dog. The dog wags its tail. The amygdala and sensory cortices light up, demanding attention. The prefrontal cortex must actively suppress the urge to stop and play with the dog.
Because they have to remember the mission.
Right. They enter their room and see a basket of brightly colored toys. Another massive inhibitory challenge. They must maintain the fragile mental image of the blue shoes against a barrage of visual distractions, locate the shoes, pick them up, and reverse the entire journey.
So when they finally walk back into the kitchen with the shoes, they haven't just done you a favor. They have successfully navigated a complex neural obstacle course.
Precisely.
And we can scale this up. Getting dressed is a daily sequence. First underwear, then shirt, then pants, then socks. You are training the brain to organize actions sequentially over time. But what about when we are cleaning up? Activity 4 dives into sorting and classification games. I fold laundry every single day. How does sorting socks build brain architecture?
To understand the power of sorting, we have to look at a classic cognitive assessment called the Dimensional Change Card Sort, or DCCS. It was developed by Philip Zalazzo.
What is that?
In a laboratory setting, researchers give a 3-year-old a stack of cards. The cards feature images like red circles, red squares, and blue squares. First, the researcher tells the child to sort by color. Put all the red ones in this box and all the blue ones in that box. 3-year-olds can generally do this quite easily.
They lock on to the single visual rule color.
Exactly. But then the researcher introduces the twist. Mid-game, they say, okay, the rules have changed. Now we are going to sort by shape, put all the circles here and all the squares there.
And what happens in the 3-year-old's brain?
They almost universally fail. They commit what is called a perseveration error. Even though they heard the new rule, and if you ask them, they can verbally repeat the new rule, we are sorting by shape. When handed a red square, they will still put it in the red box. Their brain gets stuck on the initial pathway.
Why? Is it a memory failure?
No, it's a failure of cognitive flexibility and inhibitory control. To switch rules, the prefrontal cortex must forcefully inhibit the established neural pathway associated with sorting by color, wipe the working memory slate clean, upload the new rule regarding shape, and shift visual attention to a completely different attribute of the object.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. The toddler brain simply lacks the myelination to execute that rapid shift reliably.
So how do we translate the DCCS from a sterile lab experiment into folding laundry in the living room? I like to think of these chores as a cognitive barbell. If I want my toddler to build mental muscle, I start with the empty bar, a simple one-step instruction.
The empty bar would be dumping a basket of clean laundry and saying, let's find all the socks. You are sorting by a single distinct category.
Yeah.
Socks versus everything else.
Once they master the empty bar, I need to add some weight. I add a plate to the barbell.
You introduce a second dimension. You take the pile of socks and say, okay, now let's sort these by whose they are. Daddy's big black socks go here. Your small striped socks go there. You have introduced a subcategory based on size and visual pattern.
And the ultimate workout, the heavy lift, is forcing the rule switch midstream, just like the card game.
Exactly. Let's use unloading groceries as the example. Rule 1, the empty bar. Cold things go in the fridge, everything else goes on the kitchen counter. They sort the milk and yogurt. Once the counter is full of non-perishables, you introduce the switch. Rule 2. Okay, new rule. Now, things in cardboard boxes go in the pantry, and things in metal cans go in the cupboard.
You are forcing them to look at the exact same pile of items they just sorted as not cold and reevaluate them based on a completely new physical dimension material type. You are directly training their brain to break out of perseveration loops.
Yes.
And the key is that the adult must verbally label the new dimension out loud. We are looking at what it is made of now. That verbal scaffold helps them make the leap.
It's vital to give them that verbal cue.
So you've spent 30 minutes doing these intense sorting games, asking their prefrontal cortex to do heavy lifting. Inevitably, that cognitive fatigue manifests as physical restlessness. The toddler hits a wall. They become explosive. They just need to run.
We've all seen it.
The assumption is usually that when it's time to run outside, the cognitive development pauses. It's just about burning off steam. But Section 5, Moving with a Mission, tells us how to harness that explosive energy.
Gross motor physical activity is biologically essential. We know that aerobic exercise triggers the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. BDNF is a protein that promotes the survival of nerve cells and is critical for synaptic plasticity, which is the ability of the brain to form new connections.
Wow, so exercise fertilizes the brain.
It really does. Exercise also drastically increases cerebral blood flow, oxygenating the brain tissue. However, the prominent researcher Adele Diamond has emphasized a critical nuance. If you want to explicitly develop executive function, raw, mindless movement is not enough. The movement must involve cognitive load.
I have to ask the obvious question, because sometimes a parent just needs a break. If I open the back door and let my kids sprint around the yard, screaming at the top of their lungs for 20 minutes while I sit on the porch, is that building executive function?
It is building cardiovascular capacity, it is utilizing the BDNF release, and it will facilitate the deep sleep we discussed earlier. All of those are necessary biological prerequisites. But no, aimless sprinting does not directly recruit the prefrontal circuits required for executive function.
The motor cortex is firing, but the top-down regulatory networks are basically offline.
Right. To build EF, you must demand that the child think while they move.
So how do we layer that cognitive load onto the chaos of outdoor play?
You introduce constraints, you introduce rules or pretend frames that force them to monitor their physical output. Instead of just running across the yard, you say, we have to sneak past the sleeping dragon. We must walk as quietly and slowly as possible.
The physical restraint required to walk slowly when your body wants to sprint is immense. You're asking the
Right. When they find a stick, they must evaluate its length relative to their foot, which is a spatial reasoning task. And they're doing all of this while navigating uneven terrain, which requires continuous proprioceptive and motor adjustments. It is an incredibly dense cognitive workout disguised as a walk.
And Activity 3 dives into specific self-regulation movement games. The canonical example used in developmental research is HTKS. What does that stand for, and why is it so effective?
HTKS stands for Head, Toes, Knees, Shoulders. It was developed by Megan McClelland and Claire Cameron Ponitz as a behavioral measure of self-regulation. In the formal version used with preschoolers, the researcher tells the child, when I say touch your head, I want you to do the opposite and touch your toes.
Oh, wow. Let's break down the mechanics of that. The child hears the word head. Their auditory processing decodes the word. The semantic network lights up the concept of their head. Their motor cortex instantly begins formulating the plan to raise their hands to their head. It is a deeply ingrained, automatic physical impulse.
Yes, and to succeed at the game, the prefrontal cortex has to intervene at lightning speed. It has to retrieve the overarching rule of the game from working memory. Do the opposite. It must send a massive inhibitory signal to abort the motor plan of touching the head.
Stop the hands.
And finally, it must formulate and execute a completely new motor plan to bend down and touch the toes.
It is a deliberate short-circuiting of an automatic response. Now, a 2-year-old is going to fail the full 4-part version of that game. How do we create a downward extension for toddlers?
You start with just a single reversal. You stand facing them and say, let's play a silly game. When I say touch your head, you touch your toes. Ready? Touch your head. They will likely touch their head the first time. You laugh, gently guide their hands to their toes, and repeat. You are training the fundamental mechanism of overriding an impulse.
The source lists several other ways to embed these microdoses of self-regulation throughout the day. It mentions the statue garden walking around, and whenever the adult randomly says statue, the child has to freeze instantly in whatever awkward pose they are currently in.
That's a fun one.
Or the soap bubble challenge. You blow a single soap bubble and say, let's watch it float. Let's see if we can let it land on the glass without popping it. The raw, visceral urge a toddler has to pop a floating bubble is astronomical. Asking them to stand there, hands by their sides, and just watch it is a monumental test of delay tolerance.
It is essentially the marshmallow test, but using a dynamic physical stimulus instead of food.
Speaking of dynamic stimuli, Activity 6 brings up music, rhythm, and movement. And I want to be clear here because the 1990s gave us the Mozart effect, the idea that just playing classical music in the nursery would turn your baby into a genius. That has been largely debunked, right?
The idea that passive exposure to complex music passively builds intelligence has not held up to rigorous replication. The neurological benefits of music for executive function require active, rhythmic engagement. The magic happens when the child attempts to synchronize their physical movement to an external auditory beat.
Why does synchronization matter to the brain?
When a child tries to bang a pot with a spoon to a steady beat you are clapping, they are engaging prefrontal cerebellar loops. They have to continuously predict when the next beat will arrive. If they hit the pot too early, they have to recruit motor inhibition to delay their next strike.
And if they're late,
If they hit it too late, they have to speed up their motor plan. They are constantly monitoring the external auditory timeline and micro-adjusting their physical body to match it. It is continuous, real-time error correction.
and beyond the rhythm, the songs themselves are incredible tools for working memory. A toddler who cannot remember a simple list of 3 instructions, shoes, coat, door, can somehow flawlessly recite all the lyrics to The Wheels on the Bus.
Because melody acts as a scaffolding structure for memory. The rhythm and pitch chunk the linguistic information together, providing a predictable framework that drastically reduces the cognitive load required for retrieval.
Oh, that makes sense.
You can exploit this. When you are singing the Itsy Bitsy Spider, and you get to the line, down came the rain and washed the spider, you suddenly stop singing.
You leave a void?
You leave a void. And the child's brain, which is anticipating the resolution of the melody, is highly motivated to retrieve the missing word out from working memory and vocalize it. It is the exact same retrieval mechanism we discussed with the completion prompts during dialogic reading, just wrapped in a musical context.
So we have reached the end of the day. We have physically exhausted the toddler with red light, green light. We have mentally exhausted them with sourdough sequencing and reverse head-toes games. The pajamas are on. As the day winds down, how do we solidify all these cognitive gains? Section 6 is all about the memory muscle. How do we press save on the day's experiences?
Activity 9 covers memory games.
Okay, let's talk about that.
The capacity of working memory grows incrementally, almost imperceptibly, through repeated strain. The document references delayed response paradigms studied by researchers like Kimberly Espy. The core cognitive action is taking a piece of information, encoding it into a mental representation, holding that representation active in your mind while a delay or a physical distraction occurs, and then retrieving it accurately.
What is physically happening in the brain during that delay? If I hide a toy under a cup and make the child wait 5 seconds before they can lift the cup, where does the memory of the toy live during those 5 seconds?
It relies heavily on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. When the toy is visible, the visual cortex is firing. When you hide the toy, the visual input ceases. To remember where the toy is, neurons in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex must continuously fire, maintaining an active, sustained representation of the object's location, even in the absence of sensory input.
The brain is essentially keeping the file open on the desktop. This is Piaget's classic A not B task. You put 3 upside-down cups on the table, you show them a small plastic duck, you place it under the middle cup, you make them wait 5 seconds, which feels like an eternity to a toddler, and then ask, where's the duck?
Exactly. And you can increase the difficulty. You can add a distraction during the delay. Hide the duck, then immediately ask the child to clap their hands twice, and then ask where the duck is. Now, the prefrontal cortex must maintain the representation of the duck while simultaneously executing a completely unrelated motor command.
Another great variation in the source is the mystery bag. You take an opaque cloth bag and put three objects inside a block, a spoon, and a ball. The child reaches their hand in without looking. They grab an object. They have to feel the shape, translate that tactile sensory data into a mental image, match that image to a vocabulary word, and announce, "It's the spoon," before pulling it out to verify.
It forces cross-modal sensory integration. They're using touch to access their visual memory and their linguistic network. You can also play subtraction games at dinner. Like at your plate, we have a carrot, a cracker, and a slice of apple. Now close your eyes. You eat the cracker. Open your eyes. What is missing?
They have to compare their current visual reality against the mental snapshot they took 5 seconds ago. But out of everything in this exhaustive document, my absolute favorite protocol is the end-of-day ritual. It is the ultimate habit to build long-term memory. As you are tucking them into bed, you ask one simple question. Tell me 3 things we did today.
Such a powerful tool.
I view this as the manual save button. If you just let the child fall asleep, the brain's glymphatic system will do its automated cleanup and some memories will stick. But when you actively ask them to recall their day, you are demanding that they manually open the mental filing cabinet. They have to locate the specific neural pathway for what happened at the park at 10 a.m., pull that file into their current working memory, and articulate it into language.
It is a profound exercise. Consistently demanding this recall across months and years strengthens the neural pathways responsible for episodic memory. It builds their autobiographical memory system. You aren't just helping them remember the park, you are teaching them how to access their own history. You are training the retrieval mechanism itself.
And if they say, "I don't know," you scaffold it. You don't just give them the answer. You say, "Well, after breakfast, we put on our coats and we walk down the street to the place with the swings." You provide the breadcrumbs until their own memory network catches the scent and fires.
Exactly.
Let's synthesize this incredibly deep dive. We have explored the underlying neurological timeline. We've established the biological non-negotiables of sleep and nutrition. We've unpacked how Vygotskian pretend play acts as method acting for inhibitory control. We've seen how spatial language during chores builds math skills, how dialogic reading wires Broca's area, how narrating are onion chopping frustration models, emotional regulation, and how sneaking past a pretend dragon turns physical movement into prefrontal training.
It's a lot of ground covered.
It is. When you look at this entire landscape of evidence-based activities, what is the ultimate takeaway for the caregiver listening right now?
The most profound takeaway is one of immense reassurance. You do not need to buy a single proprietary product to build a brilliant, resilient brain. The cognitive architecture required for a child to thrive is not found in an app store or a catalog of educational toys. The most scientifically validated, neurologically potent tools are entirely free, and they are embedded in the friction of daily life.
That is so freeing.
Sorting your laundry by shape, pretending a cup is a hat, waiting for the bubbles on the pancake batter, and talking through a picture book are the most elite forms of cognitive training available.
The chaos of the living room isn't preventing the development. The chaos is the gymnasium.
Precisely. And the single highest leverage upstream investment you can make is not in scheduling another structured activity. It is in protecting the caregiver's capacity.
Protect the caregiver.
The entire system of cognitive scaffolding relies on warm, contingently responsive human interaction. If the adult's nervous system is chronically depleted, they cannot provide the regulatory anchor the child needs. Your capacity for sleep, your moments of calm, your ability to be present, that is the engine that drives the child's neurological growth. Regulated adults build regulated children.
That is the perfect foundation to end on. We have spent an hour dissecting how the toddler brain thrives. It thrives when we narrate our struggles aloud instead of hiding them. It thrives when we break complex, overwhelming tasks down into single, manageable steps. It thrives when we put away the digital screens, step outside, and attach deliberate physical movement to our goals. And it thrives when we take time at the end of the day to recall what actually mattered.
I couldn't agree more.
And as I look at that list of optimal toddler protocols, it forces a rather provocative realization. In our modern, hyper-distracted, chronically stressed world where we are constantly task-switching, hiding our struggles, and staring at screens, isn't that exact toddler protocol precisely what our adult brains desperately need to function to?